Rain slicked the glass towers of Chicago into rivers of gold and neon, and 40 floors above the street. Domenico Rossi stood at the window of his penthouse with a glass of Barolo he wasn't drinking. Somewhere out there, in the dark scene between two buildings, a woman he had never met was deciding whether he would live to see more. Elena Voss lay flat against the cold rooftop gravel, cheek pressed to the stock of a suppressed rifle, breath slowing into the rhythm her instructors had beaten into her a decade ago. Through the scope, Dom's face filled the reticle, the sharp line of his jaw, the dark eyes that had put 6 men in the ground and never once flinched. Her finger found the trigger guard, not the trigger. Not yet. The veil had taught her patience before it had taught her how to kill, and she had learned both lessons perfectly. She had killed a diplomat in Vienna with a hairpin, a smuggler in Marrakesh with his own knife, still warm from cutting fruit for his daughter, a judge in Sao Paulo who never woke from what looked like a peaceful heart attack. Each face flickered behind her eyes now, a grim slideshow of a life spent as someone else's weapon. She had never hesitated. She told herself she wasn't hesitating now. She was simply waiting for a cleaner shot. Dom turned from the window, and the moment broke. He hadn't seen her. He never would have. But something in the set of his shoulders, a loneliness so total it looked almost like armor, made her lower the rifle half-inch before she caught herself. Get the job done, Elena. Feel nothing. 3 nights later, under the white marble and hushed reverence of the Art Institute's East Wing, she saw him again, this time without a scope between them. He was studying a Caravaggio with the quiet intensity of a man who understood suffering intimately, and when she stepped beside him and murmured something about the chiaroscuro, about how the painter had used darkness the way a knife uses silence, his dark eyes finally lifted to hers. Something passed between them in that instant. Electric, dangerous, alive, the kind of current that should have warned them both to run. Neither of them did. She told him her name was Isabella Moreau. It was the first lie of many. It would not be the last time a lie between them felt more honest than the truth. The ruthless mafia boss fell in love with the woman sent to kill him. Domenico Rossi had not always been a man made of ice. There had been a boy once, in a cramped apartment above his father's tailor shop on Taylor Street, who had loved nothing more than the smell of fresh bread from the bakery downstairs, and the Sunday afternoons his father spent teaching him to fold a suit jacket with surgeon's precision. Salvatore Rossi had been an honest man in a dishonest business, laundering money for the Chicago outfit through his little shop, believing that if he kept his hands clean enough, the darkness around him would never touch his son. He was wrong. On a July night, when Dom was 17, 3 men from a rival crew walked into that shop and put 2 bullets in Salvatore's chest over a debt that was never his to pay. Dom found him on the floor amid scattered bolts of Italian wool, blood pooling black in the dim light, his father's hand still curled as if reaching for something just out of frame. That night broke something in Dom that never fully healed. It also built something in its place, colder, harder, more useful. Within 10 years, he had climbed from a foot soldier's obscurity to command the entire Rossi organization, absorbing 3 rival families along the way through a combination of surgical violence and ruthless discipline that made grown men's hands shake in his presence. Now, at 38, Dom ruled a shadow empire that stretched from the docks of Chicago to shipping lanes in Miami and quiet accounts in Zurich. His penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a building he owned outright, ringed with security so thorough that even the pigeons on the balcony had, at various points, been suspected of being surveillance devices. 6 men guarded the elevator bank at all times. His driver carried a weapon Dom had personally selected. His accountant answered to no one but him, and his lieutenant, Marco Bianchi, a barrel-chested man who had been at Dom's side since they were boys running numbers together, would have died for him without hesitation, and very nearly had twice. And yet, for all his power, Dom's world had the particular emptiness of a mansion with no one living in it. He filled the silence with art. It was his only true indulgence, the one soft place in an otherwise armored life. His private study held 3 original Renaissance-era pieces, acquired, he would say, with a thin smile, through aggressive negotiation, And he could speak for hours about the anatomy studies of Leonardo or the tortured shadows of Caravaggio's late work. Works that understood, better than any person in his life ever had, that beauty and violence were not opposites but close cousins. His days moved in a fixed and brutal rhythm. Mornings were for ledgers and blood debts, disguised in the polite language of business. Afternoons were for meetings in the back rooms of restaurants he owned, where men twice his age deferred to him because they had learned, at terrible cost, what happened to those who didn't. Evenings, when the empire allowed it, he retreated to galleries and auction previews, moving alone through crowds of people who had no idea that the quiet, elegant man studying the brushwork beside them had ordered a man's death that same afternoon. It was at one such preview, a private opening at the Art Institute for a visiting collection of Baroque masters, that Dom's carefully controlled world tilted on its axis. He had been standing before a small, dark Caravaggio, lost in the way the artist had carved light out of near-total blackness, when a voice beside him, low and faintly accented, said, "Most people look at that painting and see violence. They miss that he's telling you where to find hope. Look at where the light falls." Dom turned. She was tall, dressed in a column of midnight blue that seemed poured on her rather than worn. Raven hair swept back to expose the clean architecture of her face, sharp cheekbones, a mouth that curved with the faint, private amusement of someone who knew a secret you didn't. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold, a stormy gray blue, direct and unflinching, the eyes of someone who had seen far more of the world's darkness than her age should have allowed. "You know Caravaggio," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know men who think they're the only ones allowed to live in the dark," she said, and are surprised when someone else understands it better than they do. Something in Dom's chest, a place he had assumed long calcified, gave an unfamiliar pull. "Domenico Rossi," he said, extending a hand he rarely offered to strangers. Her fingers were cool, her grip firm without deference. A small thing, but no one shook Dom's hand like an equal. "Isabella Moreau," she said. He did not know, could not have known, that the name was a costume as carefully constructed as the dress she wore, or that the woman wearing it had spent 3 months memorizing the exact rhythm of his security detail shift changes, the make of his cars, the names of his lieutenants, the precise angle of the balcony where he took his coffee every morning at 7. All he knew, standing in that quiet gallery with the rain beginning against the tall windows outside, was that for the first time since his father died, he did not feel alone. It was, he would later think, the most dangerous feeling of his life. The Veil did not recruit. It harvested. Elena had been 19, orphaned twice over, first by the car accident that killed her parents outside Geneva, then by the foster system that shuffled her between homes with the efficiency of a machine processing inventory. When a recruiter named Klaus Adler found her in a Berlin fighting gym, dismantling a man twice her size with the economy of motion that made the room go quiet. He did not offer her a job. He offered her a purpose, a family, a reason to keep the fury inside her from consuming her whole. It took her 3 years to understand that the Veil was not a family. It was a hand, and she was its favorite finger, and hands do not love the fingers that serve them. But by then she had already killed for them a dozen times, had already let them carve away the softer parts of herself in the name of discipline, until what remained was lethally, beautifully efficient, 6 languages, a black belt in 3 disciplines, expertise in poisons, ballistics, and the far subtler art of making a man fall in love with a lie. Domenico Rossi was, on paper, a straightforward contract, a rival syndicate, the Moretti family, bleeding market share to Dom's expansion into their Miami shipping routes, had paid an obscene sum to have him removed cleanly, without a war that would draw federal attention to everyone involved. The Veil had assigned Elena because she did not fail. In 4 years, she never had. She had studied him for 3 months before she ever stood close enough to touch him. She knew his morning coffee order, espresso, no sugar, taken alone on the east balcony at 7. She knew the names of his 6-man security rotation, and which 2 could be bribed, in theory, though the Veil preferred cleaner methods. She knew he visited his mother's grave on the anniversary of his father's murder and stood there for exactly 11 minutes, never longer. She knew, from patient surveillance, That beneath the violence and the tailored suits was a man who read poetry he never quoted aloud and who kept, in a drawer no one else had access to, a photograph of his father's tailor shop before the blood. She told herself the knowledge was tactical. She told herself, later, in the dark of her hotel room, that the ache she felt reading his file was professional thoroughness and nothing more. The gallery approach had been calculated down to the sentence. The Caravaggio line was rehearsed. The midnight blue dress had been selected because her handler, a cold woman named Priya Kong, had determined it was 3 shades darker than anything in Dom's known preferences. Deliberately, subtly wrong, so that his attention would be drawn to the woman defying his taste rather than performing to it. Men like Dom Rossi were bored by women who try to please them. It worked better than the file predicted. Their first dinner came 4 days later, at a private table in a restaurant Dom owned, but rarely used for pleasure. Candlelight caught the dark wine in his glass, and the small, genuine smile he seemed unable to fully suppress when she made him laugh. A rough, surprised sound, like a door-long rusted finally opening. "You don't talk like the women I usually meet," he said. "Is that a compliment?" "It's a warning," he said, though his eyes were soft. "I don't trust easily." Good, she thought, and hated herself for the small twist of guilt the thought produced. "Don't trust me. You be right not to." She planted the first device that night, a microtransmitter no larger than a grain of rice, tucked into the lining of the jacket he draped over his chair while he took a call in the hallway. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her heart, infuriatingly, was not. Over the following weeks, the dinners multiplied. She learned things the file hadn't captured. The particular gentleness with which he spoke about his late father, the way his jaw tightened with something like shame when he mentioned the violence his empire required, the surprising tenderness in his hands when he helped her into her coat, as though she were something rare rather than something replaceable. She began to notice, with rising alarm, that she was memorizing these details not for her handlers, but for herself. Each report she filed to Priya grew shorter, more clipped, stripped of anything that might reveal how carefully she was starting to listen for the sound of his voice, how the 11 minutes he spent at his father's grave had begun to feel, to her, like a wound she wanted to close rather than a weakness to exploit. "You are not falling for the mark," she told her reflection one night, gripping the edges of a hotel sink until her knuckles whitened. "You do not fall. You finish the job." But somewhere between the third dinner and the fourth, between the careful placement of a listening device and the unguarded moment Dom told her about a Sunday afternoon folding suit jackets with his father, Elena Voss, assassin, ghost, weapon of an organization that did not believe in mercy, felt the first hairline crack in the armor she had spent a decade building. It terrified her more than any mission ever had. Spring in Chicago arrived reluctantly, the way most good things did in that city, grudging, cold-edged, but undeniable once it finally settled in. Dom found himself rearranging his schedule around Isabella with a frequency his lieutenants noticed and were wise enough not to mention. They walked the Riverwalk at dusk, her arm looped through his, both of them performing an ease that Dom, at least, had stopped performing weeks ago. They argued cheerfully about Renaissance versus Baroque, about whether Machiavelli had been misunderstood or simply honest, about 100 small things that mattered to no one and yet mattered enormously in the accumulating architecture of intimacy. Their first kiss happened in the rain outside a jazz club on a Tuesday night, unplanned and unrehearsed on both their parts, which was, for Elena, the most unsettling part of all. She had kissed March before. It was a tool deployed with precision. This kiss arrived before she decided to allow it, his hand at her jaw, rain running down both their faces, and when he pulled back to search her expression for permission, she gave him none because she was too busy fighting the unfamiliar urge to pull him back in. "I don't know what you're doing to me," he murmured against her temple, and she felt the words land somewhere dangerously close to her heart. "I'm doing my job," she wanted to say. "I'm going to kill you." Instead, she said nothing and let him kiss her again. The first night they spent together came 2 weeks later, in his penthouse, the city glittering below them like a field of captured stars. He was slower, gentler than she'd expected of a man with his reputation, attentive in a way that felt less like seduction and more like reverence, as if he were memorizing her. Afterward, in the dark, he told her about the tailor's shop, about the smell of bread and wool, about finding his father on the floor and the exact moment the boy he'd been stopped existing. "I've never told anyone that," he admitted, his voice rough. "Not even Marco knows all of it." Elena lay with her cheek against his chest, listening to the steady drum of a heart she had been sent to stop, and felt something inside her fracture cleanly in two. One half remained the operative, cataloging exits, noting the absence of visible weapons, calculating how easily she could end this if ordered to. The other half, newer, terrifying, undeniably real, simply wanted to stay exactly where she was. This is the job, she told herself desperately. This is what it looks like when the job is going well. She almost believed it, until the night 3 weeks later when Priya's voice crackled through an encrypted line with new orders. Accelerate the timeline. The Morettas were growing impatient. Use the Gallery Gala the following week as the extraction point. Elena stood on Dom's balcony after the call, a blade, thin, ceramic, undetectable by any scanner, already slid from its sheath at her wrist, and watched him sleep through the glass of the bedroom door. It would take 4 seconds. She had done it in less. She stepped inside. She stood over him. The blade caught the moonlight, a sliver of cold intention. Dom stirred, murmured her name, her false name. In his sleep, reached for her without waking, and closed his hand around empty air where she should have been. Elena's breath left her in a single, silent tremor. She resheathed the blade before he opened his eyes, and when he did, blinking up at her with sleepy confusion, she told him she'd simply gotten up for water. It was, she understood with sick clarity, the first lie she had ever told that cost her something to speak. Something shifted in Dom after that night, though he couldn't have said precisely what. He found himself softer in ways his organization found unnerving, patient with underlings he once would have struck for the same mistakes, generous in negotiations where he once would have been merciless. Marco noticed it first. "You're different," Marco said one evening, watching Dom straighten his cuffs before leaving to meet Isabella, an almost boyish care in the gesture. "I haven't seen you like this since before your father. Is that a problem?" "It's a liability," Marco said, not unkindly. "Men like us don't get to have soft places, Dom. Soft places get found. And exploited." Dom brushed the warning off with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong about people before. A confidence Elena's continued presence in his life was, without his knowledge, actively disproving. He introduced her to his world in stages, each one a small act of trust that landed on Elena like a blow. First to Marco, over dinner, where Marco's sharp eyes studied her with the wary respect of a man who protected his boss for a living and did not like variables. Then to the wider circle, his capos, his accountant, the network of men and women whose loyalty had been bought with fear and, in rarer cases, genuine love. Finally, on a warm evening in early June, he took her to his mother's grave, standing beside her in the cemetery where his father also rested, and told her, voice thick with an emotion he rarely permitted himself, that he had never brought anyone here before. "I've never loved anyone the way I'm starting to love you," he said, the words dragged up from somewhere deep and unguarded. "I didn't think I had it in me anymore. I thought that part of me died with my father." Elena felt the confession land like a physical weight against her ribs. She should have reported it, a vulnerability, a leverage point, exactly the kind of intelligence the veil paid her to gather. Instead, she found herself memorizing the exact cadence of his voice, wanting to press it somewhere safe, somewhere no handler could ever reach it. That night, she made a decision that would unravel everything. She contacted Priya and, for the first time in her career, lied in a field report, claiming Dom's security had tightened beyond safe extraction parameters. Buying herself time she told herself she needed for a cleaner kill and knew, in the honest core of herself, she'd spent a decade trying to silence. She needed simply to keep existing in this stolen, borrowed happiness a little longer. It was sabotage. She understood the word clearly, even as she committed the act. Their intimacy deepened in the weeks that followed, urgent and desperate in a way neither of them named aloud, as though some animal part of both of them understood. Without being told, that time was a resource bleeding away beneath their feet. Dom's hands found new tenderness. Elena's guilt found new depths. Between them, wrapped in silk sheets and stolen mornings, something real and something built entirely on deception grew tangled together so thoroughly that neither of them could any longer say where the performance ended and the truth began. "Marry me," Dom said once, half joking, watching dawn break pink and gold over the city from his balcony, her back against his chest, his arms wrapped around her like a vow. Elena laughed, because the alternative was weeping, and said nothing that could be mistaken for an answer. Somewhere in a secure facility in Prague, Priya Kong reviewed Elena's increasingly evasive reports with mounting suspicion and began, quietly, to prepare a contingency, the veil, reserved for assets who forgot which side of the blade they were meant to stand on. Priya's patience expired on a humid night in late June. 6 months, she said over the secure line, her voice flat with the particular menace of someone who had once been kind and had trained it out of herself. 6 months, Elena, and Rossi is still breathing. Explain to me why I shouldn't assume you've been compromised. He's more heavily guarded than the file suggested, Elena said, the lie sliding out smoother than she liked. I need another 2 weeks. You have 1, Priya said, and the line went dead. Elena stood in her hotel room long after the call ended, staring at a face in the mirror she barely recognized. Hollowed by guilt, sharpened by fear, still unmistakably the face of a killer wearing love like a disguise she could no longer take off. Dom, for his part, had begun to notice small inconsistencies he couldn't quite name. A hesitation before certain questions, a tension in her shoulders when his phone rang at odd hours, the way she sometimes flinched, almost imperceptibly, when he moved too quickly toward her. He said nothing. He told himself it was paranoia, the occupational hazard of a man who had survived this long by trusting no one, and yet the unease sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't dislodge. The attack came on a Thursday. Dom was leaving a meeting with a shipping contact when the first shots rang out. A Moretti crew, growing desperate as their patience with the Veil's contract ran out, deciding to finish the job themselves rather than wait for an assassin who kept missing her window. Bullets tore through the air, shattering the window of his car, and in the chaos that followed, Elena moved before conscious thought could stop her. She put 2 attackers down with the cold efficiency of a decade's training, disarming a third with a move that broke his wrist audibly, and dragged Dom, bleeding from a graze along his shoulder, more startled than hurt, behind the cover of a concrete pillar with a strength and precision that no ordinary woman should have possessed. Dom stared at her in the ringing aftermath, chest heaving, blood soaking through his shirt, and saw, for the first time, the ghost of who she truly was flickering beneath the surface of the woman he loved. "Who are you?" he breathed. "Someone who just saved your life," Elena said, which was true, and said nothing else, which was the greater truth she couldn't yet face. That night, in the aftermath of adrenaline and fear, guilt finally overwhelmed her. She sat on the edge of his bed while a doctor loyal to the family stitched his shoulder, and when they were finally alone, she pressed her forehead to his and wept, an act so foreign to her that her own body seemed startled by it. "I have done terrible things," she whispered. "You have no idea. I know exactly what kind of man I am," Dom said, misunderstanding, cupping her face with a tenderness that made her guilt unbearable. "I've done terrible things, too. It doesn't change what I feel for you. I love you, Isabella. God help me, I love you completely." The words should have felt like victory. They felt instead like a verdict. Elena said the words back to him. And for the first time in her adult life, she meant every syllable, which made the lie she was still living feel less like a mission and more like a slow, self-inflicted execution. The device was small, easily missed by anyone who hadn't spent a lifetime learning to notice things others overlooked. But Marco Bianchi had spent exactly the kind of lifetime at Dom's side, and when he found the transmitter tucked into the lining of a jacket Isabella had once draped over a chair, his blood went cold. He brought it to Dom without ceremony, setting it on the desk between them like a live grenade. "Where did you find this?" "Your jacket," The one she was near the night of the gallery gala. Marco's jaw tightened. I've had questions about her for months, Dom. I didn't say anything because you were happy, and God knows you've earned it. But this isn't a coincidence. Dom held the device in his palm, feeling something inside him. Trust, hope, the fragile new architecture of love he'd allowed himself to build, collapsed floor by floor. He confronted her that night on the penthouse balcony, the city sprawled indifferent and glittering below them, the device sitting on the table between them like an accusation neither needed to voice. "Explain this," he said, his voice a low, dangerous quiet she had never heard from him before. Elena looked at the transmitter, and something in her simply stopped fighting. A decade of discipline, of lies constructed and maintained with surgical precision, gave way all at once. "My name isn't Isabella Moreau," she said. "It's Elena Voss. I work for an organization called The Veil. I was sent here to kill you, Dom. 9 months ago, I've been planting devices, gathering intelligence, preparing for an extraction that was supposed to happen months ago." The silence that followed was the loudest sound Dom had ever heard. Was any of it real? His voice cracked on a question, all the careful control of a man who ruled an empire dissolving into something raw and wounded. Any of it at all? All of it, she said, tears finally breaking free. "Every second. I fell in love with you somewhere between the first line and now, and I don't know how to make you believe that, but it's the only true thing I have left to give you." Dom's hand trembled, not with the desire to strike her, though every instinct honed by a decade of ruthless survival screamed at him to end the threat standing in front of him. Instead, he simply stood there, a king unmade, staring at the woman who had walked into his carefully guarded life and found the one door he'd never thought to lock. "I should kill you," he said quietly. "I know. I'm not going to." Marco, watching from the doorway, tensed. "Dom," I said, "I'm not going to kill her." Dom's voice hardened into command. "But she's not leaving this building. Lock the East Wing. She stays under guard until I decide what happens next." It was, Elena understood as two of Dom's men led her away, both a mercy and a cage, proof that whatever she'd broken between them, some fragment of what he felt for her had survived the wreckage. She had barely settled into the guarded room when her phone, confiscated but not yet destroyed, buzzed with a message routed through 3 anonymizing relays. "Compromise confirmed. Sending cleanup team. You know the protocol for failed assets, Elena. I'm sorry it came to this. Priya." The Veil did not tolerate loose ends, and Elena had just become the loosest end in the organization's history. An unseasonable cold front rolled off Lake Michigan that night, coating the city in the season's first fragile snow, delicate flakes catching the penthouse's exterior lights like scattered glass. Dom stood on the balcony where their story had nearly ended twice already, staring out at the storm, when Marco burst through the doors. Movement in the parking structure. 6 armed operatives. Professional, not Moretti's people. This is her organization. Dom didn't hesitate. "Get her. Now." They brought Elena to the balcony, snow settling in her dark hair, her wrists still marked from the restraints she'd worn for 6 hours. Dom crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and took her face in both hands, snow melting against their skin, the city's lights blurred gold through the falling white. "I need the truth," he said. "All of it. Right now, because we might not get another chance." "I was recruited at 19, she said, the words finally unspooling freely, without calculation, without armor. "I've killed for the Veil for a decade. I was sent to kill you because your expansion was strangling the Morettis, and they paid enough to make it worth the risk. I studied you for 3 months before I ever spoke to you. Every date, every kiss, every confession, it started as a performance. But somewhere along the way it stopped being one, and I didn't know how to tell you without losing you, and I was so afraid of losing you that I lied instead. And I'm so sorry, Dom. I am so sorry." Gunfire erupted below them, the first wave of Veil operatives breaching the lobby, and there was no more time for confession. Later, Dom said, pulling a weapon from beneath his jacket and pressing a second into her hand, an act of trust so absolute it silenced every doubt in her mind. Survive first. Talk later. They fought together on that snow-slicked balcony and through the corridors beyond it, moving with a synchronized brutality that spoke to something neither violence nor love alone could explain. Two people who had learned each other's rhythms so completely that even in combat, they moved like a single organism. Elena disarmed a man twice her size with the same economy of motion that had once impressed a Berlin recruiter. Dom fought with the barely restrained fury of a man, defending not just his empire, but the one soft, unguarded thing he had left. When the last operative fell, gasping, at the balcony's edge, Elena stood over him with her weapon raised and did not fire. She hauled him instead toward the door, toward men who would extract information rather than a corpse, and turned back to find Dom watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read: awe, fear, love, and grief all tangled together in the dark eyes she had grown to need like air. "You didn't kill him," Dom said. "I'm done killing people who don't deserve it," Elena said. "I've spent a decade doing exactly that. I'm not doing it anymore. Not for them. Not for anyone." Snow fell silently around them both, and for one suspended moment, standing amid the wreckage of a battle and the wreckage of every lie between them, it felt almost like the world might let them simply exist together, unbothered, undamned. The moment did not last. Somewhere below, sirens began, and Marco's voice crackled urgently over the radio. The Morettis, sensing chaos, had chosen tonight to make their move as well. The war, it seemed, was only beginning. The following 48 hours would later be spoken of, in the hushed and careful language of Chicago's underworld, as the night the old order finally broke. The Moretti family struck first, hitting 3 of Dom's warehouses simultaneously in a coordinated assault meant to cripple his operation before the Vale's remaining assets could finish what their contract demanded. Dom met the assault with the full, terrible weight of an empire built over a decade of calculated ruthlessness. But for the first time in his career, he fought not for territory or reputation, but for a future he had only just allowed himself to imagine. Elena fought beside him, no longer performing a role, but simply being, at last, entirely herself. A woman of formidable and terrible skill, turned finally towards something she believed in. The heaviest cost came at the docks, where Marco led a defense against a combined Moretti-Vale strike team attempting to seize Dom's shipping routes. He held the line long enough for his men to escape, taking 3 bullets in the process, and by the time Dom reached him, kneeling in the blood-slicked rain beside the man who had been his brother in every way that mattered, there was nothing left to do but hold his hand as the light went out of his eyes. "Take care of her," Marco whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "She's good for you, Dom. I saw it before you did. Don't let this cost you or two." Dom's grief, when it came, was silent and total. The particular devastation of a man who had already buried his father and now buried the closest thing he'd had to a brother. Both losses carved from the same relentless world he had built and could not seem to escape. Elena found him an hour later, kneeling still beside Marco's body, snow and rain mixing into a gray, grieving slush around them, and she did not offer empty comfort. She simply knelt beside him, took his hand, and stayed because some grief does not need words, only presence. The final confrontation came at dawn, in an abandoned rail yard where the last of the Vale's kill team, augmented by a handful of desperate Moretti survivors, made their stand. The battle was brutal, close, and merciless, a chaos of gunfire and shattered glass, and the particular fury of people fighting not for money or territory, but for their entire future. A bullet meant for Elena's back found Dom instead, who had thrown himself into its path without a fraction of hesitation, the impact driving him to his knees in the frost-hardened dirt, blood blooming dark and immediate across his shirt. "No!" Elena's scream tore something loose in her chest as she dropped beside him, pressing both hands against the wound with the desperate, useless pressure of someone who had witnessed 100 deaths and had never once cared this much about preventing one. "Stay with me," she begged, tears freezing against her cheeks. "Dom, stay with me. Please, I can't. I won't survive losing you too." "Wasn't going to," Dom managed, a ghost of his old, dangerous smile flickering weakly across pale lips. Let them take the only good thing I've ever had. Elena refused every instinct that told her to run, to disappear into the chaos and vanish the way the Veil had trained her to vanish from every crime scene she'd ever left behind. She stayed instead, weapon in one bloodied hand, Dom's failing pulse beneath the other, and held the line against the last of their enemies with a fury that came from somewhere far beyond training. From love, unguarded and absolute, the kind she had spent a lifetime believing herself incapable of feeling. By the time the last shot rang out across the rail yard, silence falling heavy and complete, Dom Rossi lay unconscious in Elena's arms, his empire's remaining enemies scattered or dead, and Elena screamed into the freezing dawn for the ambulance already racing toward them, praying, for the first time in her life, to a god she had long since stopped believing could hear her. Dom woke 3 days later in a private hospital room secured by men still loyal enough to guard a boss who might not survive the week, sunlight cutting pale gold through half-drawn blinds, and the first thing he saw was Elena asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand still curled around his despite the awkward angle, dark circles bruising the delicate skin beneath her eyes. "You stayed," he rasped. Her eyes flew open, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, the relief between them too large for words. "I told you," she whispered finally, pressing her lips to his knuckles. "I'm done running. From anything. From anyone." The weeks that followed brought their own reckoning. The remnants of the Moretti family, leaderless and broken, folded quietly into obscurity or federal custody. The Veil, having lost its kill team and its most valuable asset in a single catastrophic operation, retreated into the shadows to lick its wounds, though Priya Kang's final message, a single line, delivered through an old contact, warning that the organization did not forgive so easily, lingered like a blade left resting against Elena's future. Dom, recovering slowly, made a decision he had turned over in his mind through long, painful nights of healing. "I'm restructuring," he told Elena one evening. The two of them back on the same balcony, where everything had nearly ended, the city spread out gold and glittering beneath a sky finally clear as snow. Smaller, legitimate fronts, enough to protect what's mine without inviting a war like this one ever again. Marco would have wanted that. He deserved a boss who learned something from all this. "And me?" Elena asked quietly. "What happens to the woman who was sent to kill you?" Dom turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his, the dark eyes that had once terrified an entire city, now soft with something that looked, unmistakably, like hope. "I've spent my whole life being told love was a weakness men like me couldn't afford," he said. "You taught me it might be the only thing worth affording. I don't want an assassin, Elena. I don't want Isabella Moreau, either. I want you, whoever that turns out to be, once nobody's paying you to be anyone else." Elena felt something in her chest finally, fully unclench, a decade of discipline and denial giving way to something she had never once believed herself allowed to want. "I don't know who that is yet," she admitted. "I've been someone else for so long." "Then we'll find out together," Dom said. "No handlers, no contracts, no more lies between us. Just this." He kissed her then, slow and unhurried. Snow long since melted from the balcony floor, the city humming quietly beneath them, indifferent to the two people who had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, found their way to something real amid so much ruin. Months later, on a warm evening beneath the same skyline, Dom would slide a ring onto Elena's finger on that same balcony, and she would say yes without a single flicker of hesitation. The first unguarded, unrehearsed yes of her entire life. The Veil would send one final message. Months after that, its tone resigned rather than threatening. "Consider your debt closed, Elena Voss. Some assets simply aren't meant to come home." She read it once, then let it go, the way she had finally learned to let go of everything the Veil had once made her, the fear, the discipline, the endless performance of a life that was never truly hers. Standing beside Dom on the balcony where a bullet had once nearly ended everything, snow now replaced by warm summer air and the distant sound of the city living its ordinary, unbothered life, Elena finally understood what she had spent a lifetime running from and had, at last, allowed herself to find. Love had been the most dangerous mission of her life. It was also, unmistakably, the only one worth completing.